As always, I like to begin a new unit with a few words from our friend Frederick Copleston. He does indeed have some things to say about Aristotle, of course. The first significant thing that I have noted in his chapter on Aristotle is how important it is to remember that this great student of Plato's was not an opponent of Plato's, as he is often portrayed to be because of the forms disagreement. And we talked plenty about that during our forms discussion, but the key is to remember that as all philosophers have disagreements, Plato and Aristotle were no exception to that. They were far from opponents or adversaries, though, and that's the first thing the Copleston notes here. First of all, Aristotle was born probably about 384 BC, so he was not overlapping with the life of Socrates, born maybe 15 years after Socrates died. But anyway, Copleston points out, even after Plato's death, Aristotle still uses the first person plural. In other words, the word we, to refer to the representatives of the Platonic doctrine of ideas, that is, the theory of forms. In other words, he's saying Aristotle still uses the word we to describe those who believe in Plato's theory of forms, meaning he was one of the people who believed it. And soon after Plato's death, Aristotle eulogizes him as the man whom bad men have not even the right to praise, and who showed in his life and teachings how to be happy and good at the same time. The notion that Aristotle was in any real sense an opponent of Plato in the academy, and that he was a thorn in the side of his master, is scarcely tenable. Aristotle found in Plato a guide and a friend, for whom he had the greatest admiration. I love that quote. Aristotle saying that Plato is the man whom bad men have not even the right to praise. And we all feel that way at times, I think. You hear a bad person singing the praises of some extremely good person, and it's just nauseating, isn't it? Because it's like, how dare he praise this person that he's not even remotely like, and blatantly contradicting in how he acts. It's like hearing some great civil rights leader maybe being praised by some tyrannical leader of sorts. No one likes to hear that. And Aristotle is saying Plato was so good that if you're bad, you better not even praise him. In 343, Aristotle was invited to Pella by Philip of Macedon to undertake the education of his son, Alexander. Then only Alexander, the 13-year-old, soon to be Alexander the Great. So this went on for some time. I can't remember exactly how long Aristotle was Alexander's tutor, but certainly Aristotle was the single biggest influence on Alexander's life educationally. So much so, Copleston points out in the next page here, that Aristotle went for a time to Stagira, his native city, which Alexander rebuilt as a payment of his debt to his teacher. Alexander the Great had a whole city rebuilt, quote, in payment of his debt to his teacher. Rebuilding a city, let's see, a few $1 billion maybe. So is that how much Aristotle charged for his tutoring? A few $1 billion? No, of course not. The point is, Alexander saw Aristotle's tutoring of him as what? Priceless, beyond that he couldn't even repay that. And that is incredibly noteworthy, that Alexander so highly regarded what he received from Aristotle that he had a whole city rebuilt in his honor. And I don't know, again, if Alexander always used the power that Aristotle gave him wisely, but there is no denying that there is much power in good philosophy, especially Aristotelian philosophy. In 335, Aristotle returned to Athens, where he founded his own school. He founded does anyone know? Lyceum. It's not as popularly referred to as Plato's Academy. To this day, academy is still used to refer to all sorts of academic institutions, but Lyceum is still relatively famous. That was founded by him, by Aristotle. They were called his classes were called the Peripatetics, and his followers were sometimes called the Peripatetics, which really just means walking. Aristotle held all of his classes walking up and down in the covered ambulatory at the Lyceum. All his classes, everybody's walking the whole time. He felt that was important for being able to remember things, maybe staying awake. As you may have noticed reading Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, it's a little drier than Plato, isn't it? A little hard to stay awake while reading it, so maybe that's half the reason he had his students always walking during his lectures. But also, it's so important to walk more often than most people do today. There was a study recently that tells us what we already knew, as all useful studies do, that there are certain types of critical thinking that only occur while you're walking. And I think anyone who's gone on a good hike knows that. And it doesn't have to be a big hike, though. Although you should try to walk regularly in peaceful settings. It's hard I wouldn't say walking down a hall here during the fall or spring semester during the day is particularly good in any sense of the word. But if there's one physical thing society today is missing, it's walking, especially in suburban and rural areas. But what we really need to walk. We benefit so much from not only physically, but again, there's thinking that happens when you walk that doesn't happen at other times, not even biking. So Aristotle really valued walking highly, so much so that all of his classes were held that way. It has been pointed out, oh sorry, I missed a quote. Aristotle had left Athens for a time, came back, but he withdrew from Athens. Why? He said, lest the Athenians sin twice against philosophy. Well, he was associated with Alexander, obviously. After Alexander's power had passed, as often happens, much opposition was roused against his legacy. Aristotle was associated with Alexander's legacy, so there was much opposition all of a sudden to Aristotle at this same time. So he decided to leave Athens lest the Athenians sin twice against philosophy, meaning they don't kill him all exactly. So, because he didn't want to get killed like Socrates was. So Aristotle was a genius. My label for him is the genius. As you know, I call Socrates the hero, the father. Plato, the wise man, who had the wisest errors in history. Aristotle, the genius. He's right on practically everything that he criticizes Plato on. He's not right on everything, period. But he is incredibly precise. So I don't suppose he was as heroic as Socrates, but we can't hold that against Aristotle. Very few people are. It has been pointed out that although a great inventor of philosophical terms, Aristotle was neglectful of style and of verbal beauty, while his interest in philosophy was too serious to admit of his employing metaphor instead of clear reason or of relapsing into myth. And I'm sure you all noticed that. Some students prefer Aristotle if they're more scientifically, mathematically minded maybe, but I think a higher number of students prefer Plato's writings because they're a little more interesting and a little more engaging, not as strict. One moment Socrates is going through this incredibly precise logical back and forth, another moment he's relaying this 20-minute long story of this dragon and gods and all sorts. So you never know what's going to come out of Socrates' mouth. Aristotle, you kind of always do. I mean, you don't know the conclusions he's going to come to because they're incredibly profound, but you always know what style. You always know that you're in for something very dry, very direct, very to the point, no meandering, no messing around. He had too much to say, too many conclusions to come to, and too little time for him to mess with any of that. So that's his style. And let's take a look at his style. One of his most important works here, many would say his most important work, Nicomachean Ethics. Why on earth Nicomachean? Well, his name was Nicomachus, named after his son. Some say that it was posthumously named after his son. Some say that his own son edited this and thereby got his own name on this. Whatever the reason, it comes from the name of his son. The good. I constantly, in earlier units, hear things from students like, oh, but when we come to conclusions like the good must be the aim, the good must be, we must be grounded in reason, directed towards the good, one must do what is good, one must live in accordance with what is good. But I always hear some students say, but people disagree on what is good, but you're good, and it might be one thing and somebody else is good, it might be another thing. And then, well, yeah, that's why we're philosophizing about it, so we can come to some clearer answers. And that's exactly what Aristotle's taking a stab at with this treatise right here. He recognizes that. He recognizes that there's too much ambiguity regarding what is meant by the good, so he's going to try and get a clearer picture of precisely that. So how do we begin? Well, we begin, as we begin all careful logical discourses, with our definitions, with the definitions that are already granted, in other words, the common ground. Aristotle, seeking common ground to begin with his readers, needs to first give us the broadest definition of the good and the least controversial, the most obvious. It's not going to be, the more obvious something is, the less helpful it is, of course, but that's okay because it is just a foundation for further building. And that good, that definition that we begin with, is that at which all things aim. That's what we're aiming at. Very simple. Everything is aiming at something. Everything intentional is aiming at something. That something, whatever it is what we call the good of that thing. The good of archery is not just the target, it's the what? The bullseye. The good must be precise and it must be one. We can't have multiple good, we can't have multiple ultimate goods. There are, of course, many goods, but there must be one ultimate good, giving all of those subordinate goods coherence. So the good is that at which all things aim. We can put any little mundane thing in that blank, and we can have a sense of what it's aiming at. The good of a car, to get you from safely and efficiently and quickly from one place to another. The good of game of basketball, at least if you're playing it, is to have more points than the opposing team when the clock runs out. That's what you're aiming at. The good of an individual shot in basketball, of course, would be the hoop. The good of a desk is to give you a solid surface to have your papers on. That's what it's aiming at. Everything is aiming at something. What is that something that each thing is aiming at? That is its good. But what is our life aiming at? What is human nature as such aiming at? Because Aristotle realizes that we all have different callings, we all have different missions, we all have different things that our individual lives will aim at. But we also share something. That something is called human nature. So what is human nature aiming at? That's what he's going to try and figure out in the next several pages. And I want to make a decent chunk of progress in this today. I don't think we'll finish this dialogue today, and that's okay. Sorry, it's not a dialogue. Treatise. Okay, first of all, he points out that the ends of the master arts are things more to be desired than all those of the arts subordinate to them. He's pointing out there's a hierarchy of goods. Some things are done for the sake of other things. But at some point, that process must end. We can't keep on saying, I do X for the sake of Y. I do Y for the sake of Z. I do Z for the sake of A. I do A for the sake of B. That can't go on forever because an infinite regress of Y's is not going to answer anything. We can even put it that way for our sheet for the second question. You cannot have an infinite regress of Y's. That's not exactly the phrasing he uses, but it's close. If, therefore, among the ends at which our actions aim, there be one which we wish for its own sake, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, which would obviously, he says, result in a process ad infinitum, so that all desire would be futile and vain. You only start moving you only start desiring any direction because it actually is aiming at something ultimate. Even if a more immediate end is something that is itself directed towards something else, you're still only bothering to even engage in that initial process of intentionally moving towards anything because of some ultimate goal. You might have many stops in your itinerary, to take an analogy from travel, but you're not going to bother leaving your house in the first place if all you see is a bunch of stops in your itinerary and you don't see the destination. There must be one ultimate thing for the process to even bother beginning. To take a more physical analogy, I've used this one before. It's a very foggy, cloudy day, so you can't see up very high, but you see a chain hanging there in the air. You give it a tug. It is solid. You conclude what? You don't even have to give it a tug. If you see a chain hanging there, you conclude it's anchored to something, right? It's not just a chain going up forever. It's got to have an anchor in order for it to have stability. So you get out of bed in the morning. Why? Well, because you want to get to class. You want to get to class. Why? So you can get a good grade. You want to get a good grade. Why? So you can get a good job. You want to get a good job. Why? So you can make money. This process can't go on forever. It's got to stop at something. There must be some ultimate end that gives all of those subordinate ends meaning in the first place. If there isn't some ultimate end, then those subordinate ends don't have any meaning. It's like a chain hanging there in the air, not anchored to anything, and you better not climb on that chain because I don't know how it's hanging there in the first place, but it's certainly not going to support your weight. It's like the example, if you wake up one morning, hopefully this never happens to anybody, but you wake up one morning and you're just, this moment you become conscious, you are just madly running. Do you just keep on running because that's what you were doing when you woke up? This is not an actual example from anyone's life. I use it because it's analogous to what we do when we realize that we haven't even decided what end our actions are aiming at. My point is that we ought not keep frantically running. If we wake up one day and realize we don't know even why we're running, maybe we should take a step back and try and ask why. And that's what Aristotle is trying to help guide us through here. I'm not saying he has it all figured out. He doesn't. I'm just saying he does give us a good foundation from which to continue seeking this end, whatever it may be. I have a note here on my sheet to draw an example to corporations who know this, who are very intelligent. They're not always very good, but they're very intelligent. And they realize this Aristotelian teaching, that there must be an ultimate end, and there must be only one. And they call it in business lingo the what? The bottom line. Every question, any individual corporation has to consider a multitude of questions. At any board meeting, there's a multitude of strategic questions to be considered. But the overarching consideration in all of them is, how does the resolution that we give to this question affect the bottom line? Because ultimately, that's all that they care about. And I'm not espousing some conspiracy theory here. I am taking it from their own lips. I almost got a business minor at RPI, and RPI is very proud of their business school, so they had this big shot businessman professor in teaching our class, and he drilled it into our heads repeatedly, had to put it in our notes, tested us on it, that there is one and only one reason for the existence of any corporation: to make money, to increase the wealth of the owners. He drilled that into us relentlessly, to the point that I almost started buying it then. And that's intelligent of them. It's not good. Intelligence is a tool. Hopefully, it is directed in accordance with wisdom. Anyway, but we should at least admire their intelligence and realizing, yes, for the sake of coherence, for the sake of consistency, for the sake of effectiveness, there must be one end. It must be ultimate, and it must give every other individual subordinate end its own direction. Now, a classmate of mine, we had an entrepreneurship class, and his conscience was rightfully tweaked by this, because that shouldn't be the ultimate end of a corporation. It should be people they serve. Anyway, let me not get into that right now. But he said, "You know what? I don't want a company to have a bottom line. I want it to have a triple bottom line. People, planet, profit. And that was cute. But when I call something cute, I don't mean that as a compliment unless I'm talking about a 2-year-old. It was a noble effort to try and have higher goals than money. But what's the problem? Maybe you can't keep a company afloat with it. Even if you could, there's just a matter of time until a situation comes up when you have to what? Choose. You're at a fork in the road, and you can only go one way or the other. One of them is favor people, one of them is favor profit. Which one are you going to do? If only more corporations said people. I don't know how many do. I'm sure there's some. I don't know if this is true, but I heard it said that Toyota is one of the companies that does favor its people and people in general. And again, I'm not saying this in my own authority. I'm just repeating what I've heard. And it was said that you can't do it that way in the business world. Well, they did a pretty good job. If you decide to treat your employees well, with dignity and justice and respect, and your customers and the common good at large, well, you've done something worthy. And just simply having the good be your end. And even if you do go out of business, so what? But actually, they've been quite successful, as some other companies have who've chosen that as their bottom line, and not just not money. Anyway, they're at least right in realizing there has to be a bottom line, there has to be an ultimate end, and it has to be absolutely one. Now, he goes in a bit of a digression here, and I don't want to spend much time on this, but perhaps surprisingly, he says what we're really doing here in ascertaining the good is what? What science are we engaging in here? Political science. Why? Well, political science is supposed to coordinate all of the individual subordinate goods of a whole society in accordance with the one end of society, namely the common good. And that's what he's trying to do here, figure out what that good consists in. We've got all sorts of departments within politics. We've got economics, finance, military, transportation, taxation, energy, health and human services. All these things are under the umbrella of politics. Politics is supposed to be that which unites all of them, directs all of them towards the one common good. Now, I've never taken a political science class, so I don't know what you guys do in political science. Is anyone here in political science doing political science major? No? Darn. So I don't know what they do in political science classes, but from what I've heard, they're not exactly striving to ascertain what the good is and direct all affairs in accordance with it. It's more about election law and polling and marketing strategies and kind of lower stuff than what Aristotle has in mind when he says political science. So he's very fond of political science, properly speaking, but I don't think he'd be very fond of what it often is today. All right. This, then, being its aim, our investigation, he says, is, in a sense, the study of politics. Now, the same exactness, he continues, must not be expected in all departments. It would be absurd, for example, to demand mathematical certainty from considerations of what we ought to do in government or morality. Some philosophers just put a roadblock up in any discussion because they demand mathematical certainty in realms that clearly have nothing to do with that type of certainty. And it's very annoying because they make it impossible to make real philosophical progress. This was a problem even in Aristotle's day. You see people, but how do I know? How do I know that I know? How do I know that I'm not just a brain in a vat somewhere with people prodding? You just got to stop at some point and just realize that you know what you know and proceed from that point forward. That's what Aristotle's trying to say here. The subjects studied by political science are moral nobility and justice. But these conceptions involve much difference of opinion and uncertainty, so that they are sometimes believed to be mere conventions and have no real existence in the nature of things, and a similar uncertainty surrounds a conception of the good. Well, who do you suppose he has in mind from well before his own day that we talked about in the very beginning of this course? Protagoras. Man is the measure of all things. Justice is mere convention. What is good for one might not be good for another. He's got Protagoras in mind, whom he specifically refuted in another work of his. Anyway, clearly, there being disagreement on a proposition does not mean that there is no true or false consideration of that proposition. So he's going to continue and try and consider the truth of this very question that some people say has no real answer. Again, relativism is not new. But first he's going to say, who is ready to engage in this? Who is ready to engage in this political discourse? Well, first of all, the young, he says, are not fit to be students of political science. And he has children in mind here. For they have no experience of life and conduct, and it is these that supply the premises and subject matter of this branch of philosophy. And it makes no difference whether they are young in years or immature in character. All right. There's a certain set of first principles that are needed to begin this particular political consideration of what is the good in general and in one's individual life. What is the proper place for the consideration of the good to begin? I'm skipping a question, I know, but let me give you the answer to this one now. He says it's the first principles that are known to those who have chosen to live a just life. Aristotle, contrasted to Plato, Aristotle was fine with democracy. But those worthy of participating in a democracy are whom? Are who? Those who have the first principles that are known by those who have chosen to live a just life. Who does this exclude? Well, we just said it. Obviously, it excludes those, rightfully so, and I don't think anyone disagrees with this, who haven't existed long enough to acquire those principles yet. He's not saying it's just the first principles of reason. You need to know a lot more than the whole is greater than the part to figure out what the good consists in, what the common good consists in. You need to simply know those things that all those who have chosen to live well know. That's what he's saying. So children haven't had enough time yet to acquire those principles. Who else does this definition exclude? Intentionally. It's not accidentally. Those who have chosen to what? Live poorly. Yeah, to not live a just life. Now this is controversial, but Aristotle would say, of course, if one has proven with his conduct that he does not operate under the principles that are necessary to consider what the good consists in, then why on earth would you want such a person using those very principles that he has just proven he operates under to decide who should be in office and what laws should be made? In other words, he's saying who should never vote? Criminals. Now, careful. That's not exactly what he's saying. That is the answer I was looking for. But bear in mind that most people who do not live a just life, in other words, most people who lack these necessary principles, are not criminals. They're just jerks. And unfortunately, it's not illegal to be a jerk. So there's clear problems with this approach. Secondly, this is the reasoning why there is something called felon disenfranchisement, and that's controversial. I'm not saying that that's right, but at the minimum, I think we probably agree they shouldn't be voting while they're in jail, while they're doing their time. I think a good argument can be made that once they're out of jail, they should be able to vote again because they've done their time, and if we're going to argue that justice is healing, which we want it to be, we should assume that they are healed once they're out, even though they're often not. But still, I'm not saying that people who've committed a crime should never be able to vote again. I'm just saying that the rationale for at least some period of not being allowed to vote after committing a serious crime makes sense, even if that period of time is simply while one is doing his or her time. So the first principles that are known by those who have chosen to live a just life. One who has chosen to live a just life has demonstrated by his or her deeds that they are operating under the type of reasoning necessary to consider and conclude what is good. Let me give you the answer, because I don't know when exactly I'm going to stumble upon it. It's always hard to keep Aristotle's treatises completely straight. Let me give you the answer to the one before that. And you already know it from the very first discussion sheet we had. So this is a bit redundant. What is first necessary for any reasoned discourse to begin? As you know, agreed premises / common ground. We talked about that plenty, I think, in class 1 and in discussion sheet 1. You cannot build a house without a foundation. A dialogue, a discourse is supposed to be something that is built together, not a debate where you're shouting each other down, trying to show how wrong the other person is. You're trying to build, not destroy, in a dialogue. And to build requires a step-by-step, solid approach. Okay. So what is this good? What does it consist in? Well, he says, the great majority of mankind are agreed about this, for both the multitude of persons and those of refinement speak of it as happiness. So is he done? Only 2 pages in, he's already done? He already figured out what the good is, happiness? No, because what? Slapping a word on something and say you have agreement is meaningless. You have to agree not just on the word you slap on something as an answer, but on what? The word's meaning, which there is little agreement on. And that's what he needs to say. Okay, happiness is what we're all after. Sure, well and good. Most people will admit that. But how useful is that if there is no actual definition as to what happiness in turn consists in? So that is what he's going to take a stab at in the following pages. We all want to be happy. I don't know anyone who doesn't want to be happy. What do we mean by that? And more importantly, what ought we mean by that? Ordinary people identify happiness with some obvious and visible good, such as pleasure or wealth. Others, when he still another, when he falls sick, thinks that health is happiness. When he is poor, he thinks that wealth is happiness. In other words, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. How often we are tempted to identify happiness itself as simply having whatever we happen to be most conscious of lacking in a given moment, and we never learn our lessons, because every time we get that relatively trivial thing that we've identified as the good itself, it only satisfies for a passing amount of time, and then we're right back to where we started off. So the grass is not greener on the other side of the fence. Others, feeling conscious of their own ignorance, admire those who propound something grand and above their heads. In other words, the sophists he has in mind here. Those who give these lengthy speeches full of big, long words that sound like music to the ears of the listeners, and they simply must be right because of how lofty what they said was. Well, remember, Aristotle might seem to some people that he's speaking loftily, but really he's being as blunt and clear as he possibly can. All right, so he's going to begin with what is known. He says next, let's begin with what we know. But he also points out that the generality of men and the most vulgar identify the good itself simply with pleasure, and accordingly they are content with a life of enjoyment by preferring what is only a life fit for Anyone get the bonus right? Cattle. It says most people live a life fit, seem to be willing to live a life fit only for cattle. In other words, identifying their good, their happiness, as just standing around snacking all day. Why? He says they get a hearing for their view is reasonable, because many persons of high position share the feelings of Sardanapalus. I had to look him up when I first read this. Sardanapalus was a hedonistic king in ancient Greece, long before Aristotle's day, who was so hedonistic, he wasn't deliberately evil, he didn't want to destroy society, but he was so fixated upon his pleasures and upon having his nation under his rule serve his pleasures that he managed to completely destroy the whole country. Sardanapalus, very interesting story there. Men of refinement, those who consider themselves refined, on the other hand, think that the good is honor, but it's not honor. Why is the good not honor? Well, he says it's too superficial. We instinctively feel that the good must be something proper to its possessor and not easy to be taken away from him. So, why? Why is this the case? Well, have any honors ever been taken away from people? Goodness, we've seen a lot of that recently. Obviously, it is better to have something within yourself, so deeply held that no one can take it away, than it is to have something even somewhat artificial and external to yourself, such that there is someone who has the power to take it away. Clearly, we would always prefer to have absolute power over something that we possess, as opposed to having something that there is anyone else who has the ability to take it away from us. And honors, of course, can be taken away. Happens all the time. Honorary degrees are stripped of people. Titles in the Olympics are deleted after it's discovered that they were using some illegal drug or cheating. These people who are revealed as sexual abusers are rightly stripped of the various honors they've received. Honors get taken away all the time. And sometimes honors are unjustly taken away. Sometimes good people have honors taken away from them just because public opinion turned to some fad and something he said was deemed politically incorrect. And all of a sudden he's evil because he said something politically incorrect. So whether it's because it's deserved or undeserved, honors are constantly taken away. They are also given to people who don't deserve them in the first place, even if they're not taken away. People who don't deserve honors get them all the time. Bad people get honored. Generally, the more powerful, the more likely those who give honors are to give honors to them in hopes of getting something in return. So, we see a lot of problem with honor being identified as the good. Let's have a couple of things down. Aristotle doesn't spend much time proving that pleasures are not the good. It might seem strange that he doesn't, but I think it makes sense because, well, first of all, he knows that Socrates refuted that full well in his back and forth with Callicles. But I think he also just has in mind that anyone who's going to bother reading something like this has already risen to the point of realizing that pleasure is not the good. I don't think he anticipates many hedonists reading his treatises. But he does at least say it's a life fit only for cattle, so we can at least have that down. Pleasure is the good. It would be a life fit only for cattle. He's not saying pleasure isn't good. He's saying when you identify pleasure as the good, you're choosing a life fit only for cattle. He's not denigrating cattle. He's saying that's a perfectly good life for a cow. You can be a good cow and just stand around and rest and eat all day. That's fine for a cow to do, not a human being. Honors, he says, are not proper to their possessors. They're not intrinsic to their possessors. Instead, they are artificially bestowed externally. How could the good itself be something artificially bestowed externally by another man? But here's the real curveball. Not even virtue is the good. He says virtue is a greater good than honor, but even virtue proves on examination to be too incomplete to be the end, since it appears possible to possess it even while you're asleep. Virtue is not like pleasure or honors. You can reject pleasure and honors completely and still be an incredibly good person. In fact, you'll probably be a better person if you do that. You can't reject virtue and still be a good person. Pleasure and honors are accidentally, meaning not essentially, accidentally attached to the good. Virtue is intrinsically directed towards the good, but it is still not the good itself. Even virtue is directed towards something outside of itself. So this is technically disagreeing with the old proverb that virtue is its own reward. This Aristotle saying virtue is necessary. It will definitely lead to that which is its own reward. And it is the only way to attain that which is its own reward. But it is still not the reward itself. We want, for example, to be temperate so that we can be happy. We don't want to be happy so that we can be temperate. You can look at any individual virtue and ask yourself why you want it. And in a sense, you'll want it for its own sake, but in another sense, you'll be able to think of something else that you want from that virtue. I want to be courageous. Why? I just like the thought of courage. Well, yeah, that you do, and that's good. It's an awesome virtue. But you want to be courageous so that in trying times you can do what is right. In trying times you can help someone in need. You want to be prudent, not so you can sit there analyzing things forever, but so that in confusing times you can you can make the wise decision, so on and so forth with all the virtues. We want them, absolutely yes, but they also point to something outside of themselves, Aristotle says. The other problem with the virtues is that they're not continuous. Whatever the good itself is, it must permeate our whole life. It can't be an on and off thing. It can't be something that we only live when the circumstances are giving us the opportunity to do so. For example, courage again. None of us are really living excessively the courageous life at this very moment because none of us have the opportunity to be excessively, extremely, heroically courageous. Individual virtues are only really active when the opportunity to exercise them arises. If someone walked into this room with a gun and started shooting, then you'd have an opportunity to be courageous. But right now, there's not a huge opportunity for that. So the virtues, in other words, are not continuous, and we should have that down also. But the good itself must be continuous. It must be who we are, always, not sometimes. Now he goes on his tangent. And I'm not going to read his tangent because we already talked about how Aristotle disagrees with Plato on the forms. But he spends a couple pages now offering a bit of a critique of the theory of forms. And while I'm not going to go into it, I will briefly read the sentence or two that he says before it. I'm sorry, before I even read that, I should point out that Aristotle, I don't know why I don't ask you for this in the discussion sheet. I just forgot to put it in there. But don't worry, that also means it won't be on the final. Clearly, he says money is not the good. The life of money-making cannot be. He says that is a constrained kind of life. Because clearly, wealth is not the good that we are in search of. For it is only as good as what? Well, money is the most obvious thing that you can see is not the good. Because you only want money so that you can what? Get rid of it. That's come up before, but it is the most obvious thing that is not an end. Money has absolutely no use on its own. Money is the one, this is going to sound really weird, but it's true. Money is the one thing that nobody on earth needs. Anything else I can think of a use for. I can't think of any use for money. That might sound weird because you can think of a lot of uses for money right now. But really, it's always a purely secondary use. You want it so you can get rid of it in order to, by getting rid of it, get something that is itself useful for something else usually. But still, money is always at least 2 levels removed from anything useful, which is why you can validly say that it is useless. In a qualified sense, of course. I'm not being anti-money here. We all need it in another sense. But anyway, he says, it would seem obligatory, especially for a philosopher, to sacrifice even one's closest personal ties in defense of the truth. Both are dear to us, yet it is our duty to prefer the truth. That is his last line before he engages in his critique of some aspects of the theory of forms. His point, well, Plato, I don't know if Plato was still alive at this point, but the followers of Plato, zealously promoting his theory of forms, certainly were. And he realized how difficult it would be to publish a criticism of the main theory of his own teacher, and that was still promoted by all of his friends. You can imagine perhaps putting yourself in his shoes. Like, imagine going on Facebook tonight and having to post something that was just completely, that was not completely, but at least somewhat contradicting something that so many of your social media friends are really zealous for. Well, that's what Aristotle is doing here by criticizing a little bit the theory of forms. But he points out the truth trumps everything. If something is true, there's no more questions to ask regarding whether to believe it, obey it, follow it, even promote it. The answer is always yes. It's true, period, end of discussion. That's what Aristotle is saying here. Everything else is worth sacrificing for the sake of truth. In a textbook I use for comparative religion, and it brings up Gandhi, it speaks of where he found the truth as the sovereign principle. Well, if something is sovereign, if a nation is sovereign, that means what? Or if a political entity is sovereign at what? Yeah. It doesn't, New York State, for example, is not sovereign because it is a subservient political entity to the USA, the national government. But if an entity is sovereign, it operates independently. It does not need to derive its authority from some higher government. Well, if truth is sovereign, that means that we don't need to waste all sorts of time looking at circumstances and opinions and preferences and polls and testing the waters and doing a bunch of marketing stuff. If something's true, you believe it, you obey it, you follow it, period. No other questions need to be asked. Yes, we need to be prudent in how we go about the details, of course, but Aristotle is pointing out the truth trumps everything. And indeed it does. I think we all know that. Anyway, he ends his criticism here pointing out that the good cannot merely, as you already know from the forms discussion, the good cannot merely be contemplated abstractly. I will give you something for your notes for this, even though we've talked about it in general enough. The good cannot merely be contemplated abstractly. Meaning detached from concrete common sense experience. It cannot be a purely abstract matter. Rather, I'll make sure I give you the right thing here. Its fullness is understood as it applies to individual natures. We cannot pretend that abstractly discovering the good is going to tell us what the good life for a human being consists in, other words. The good, yes, it's that at which all things aim. And we can say even more specific things about the good, as we'll see in the upcoming pages. and which we'll finish next week. But still, to actually give as helpful as possible an explication of the good, we have to look at the good of blank. And something needs to go in that blank. To figure out what the good life consists in, we have to look at the good of human nature. What does human nature itself demand? What is human nature itself directed towards? Only by looking at that can we understand and live by the good. We can't just abstractly contemplate it and suppose that that is sufficient for answering the question. And I have a good stopping point in the next page, but let's get to that. All right, he says, let us conclude our discussion of this subject, in other words, his criticism of the theory of forms. We may now return to the good, which is the object of our search, and try to find out what exactly it can be. What definition of the good will hold true in all the arts? So he's getting a little more specific. He defined the good as broadly as possible in the very beginning of this treatise, and now he's saying, what about all the arts? Meaning all of the intentional undertakings that we perform, all the crafts, the sciences, everything really. He says that for the sake of which everything else is done, which might not sound much different, but it is a specification. That for the sake of which everything else is done. And he's getting to the art of living here. If there is an art of living, and of course there is, then every individual thing we do in our lives must have something else for the sake of which those individual things are done. What is it? Well, continuing on. A thing never chosen as a means to anything else is more final than things chosen both as ends in themselves and as means to that thing. And accordingly, a thing chosen always as an end and never as a means, we call absolutely final. Now, happiness appears above all else to be absolutely final in this sense, since we always choose it for its own sake. But no one chooses happiness for the sake of honor, pleasure, etc. Happiness, I can't find the quote now, but I think I have it in my head, so let me just give it to you from memory. Why is happiness absolutely final? I think that's the next question in your sheet. Aristotle has a great quote on it. Not sure if I'm remembering it correctly now, being that I didn't stumble upon it looking at the treatise. Standing by itself alone. If anyone finds the quote in the treatise, you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong at all. Standing by itself alone, it renders life desirable and lacking nothing. Someone who is genuinely happy, again in the full sense of the word, the ancient Greek sense of the word of eudaimonia, living the blessed life, living the good life, the flourishing life, a human being what a human being ought to be. Someone who has that happiness has all that is necessary. He doesn't wish he had something else because he already has the very thing that all those other things are directed towards. He doesn't envy anybody else for whatever that somebody else might have because he already has the very thing that all of those other things that somebody else has are themselves directed towards. He has nothing to envy in anyone. He has nothing to destroy his peace. His peace is permanent. His peace is invincible because he has the object of his desires already. So while some philosophies or religions might say one must eliminate all desire, this is even more powerful because it gives you the object of all desire in such a way that no one can take it away from you. There's still much more that needs to be said, though, on how to go about detailing that. Aristotle admits he still hasn't been specific enough about what this consists in. After all these pages, he admits, he even says, all of this might even just be a truism. He just spent all his time philosophizing about happiness and the good and what's not the good, and he just admits here, he's very humble, willing to kind of be self-deprecating. He says, to say that the supreme good is happiness might appear a truism. In other words, a tautology, a self-evident statement, not even worth saying. Still, to be useful, Aristotle says, we must be more specific about what it consists in, about ascertaining man's function. That is to say, about ascertaining what it is that human nature itself is directed towards. Until we can give a good answer to that, we still can't say what this thing that we so want and so need actually is. But let's dive into that next week. Last week, when we ran out of time, we were just about to get to Aristotle, the climax of this book of Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle is about to give his famous definition of the good of man, how one goes about ascertaining the good as it pertains to human life, to human nature. Real quick recap of the few items from before that, though. We didn't talk about another famous quote of his that's also right here in Nicomachean Ethics, where he says, man is by nature a social being. You don't need this in your notes, but this is often referred to as the zoon, I hope I'm spelling this right, I'm probably not, politikon. You'll hear that referred to, which is why I put that in the board. Zoon, the political animal, is another way of putting this, another way of translating Aristotle's teaching that man is by nature a social being. This is an important teaching of Aristotle's because it flies in the face of more modern political theory, especially Thomas Hobbes et al., who say, no, man is not by nature a social being. All social realities, whether it's state or community of any sort, church, religion, any sort of social dimension of man, is not attached to his nature. It is not intrinsic to his nature. It is not necessary. It is an artificial thing. It's a mere social what? Some of you have probably heard of this before. Social contract. Basically, if we didn't have these various social contracts keeping us in check, we'd all just be constantly killing each other. So in order to prevent us from killing each other, we draw up these contracts and we call it church and state and all these other things, even family. But Aristotle completely disagrees with that. That theory didn't exist in his day, so he wasn't disagreeing with anything. He was just stating what he thought was obvious, and I dare say was obvious, and is obvious, that we are social beings. Our relations with other people are not things that we enter into in a merely utilitarian basis so as to avoid being killed. We enter into relationships and into any community because we need it, because we're social beings. And of course, you can disagree with that. You could side with Thomas Hobbes if you want, but I think that a certain unfortunate, very tragic occurrence that is unfortunately seeming to become more common vindicates Aristotle. Have we talked about feral children at all? Has that come up in any previous classes? No. It's very sad. Has anyone heard of this? It's an unfortunate title almost, but anyway, I'll back up a moment. Let's say a dog is purchased at a very young age as a tiny little puppy and raised in a family of humans, as often happens, and let's say, for the sake of argument, it never sees another dog for its whole life after its first week or two or whatever when it was purchased. Even after living for years and years with this family of human beings, this dog is still basically behaving like a what? A dog. Because a dog, yes, other animals are social also, but not as much as man is, not as necessarily. Who they are is basically pre-programmed into them instinctually. And sure, we have some instincts, but nothing like all other animals do. We need to learn how to be human from other humans. And that's what Aristotle is saying by teaching that we are social beings. That's part of our nature, to be in community with others. Any other animal is basically still going to act in accordance with its nature, even if it never sees another being of its own species. And yet, with man, And coming back to the feral children example, there are these tragic cases where these sick, twisted parents or foster parents or whatever, they take these children from an extremely young age and basically lock them in a room for years and years and years, their whole life, until they're finally rescued because maybe a neighbor notices what's going on, who knows. But sure, they throw food in the door once a day maybe, but that's it. So these children are raised with no social interactions at all whatsoever. And when they're finally rescued from this torture, really, they still have the intrinsic and infinite dignity of a human being, don't get me wrong, but behaviorally, you can't even identify any human nature in them. And if this goes on too long, they become permanently incapable of becoming an ordinary human being. You can't even teach them language. It's incredibly tragic. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm not at all intending to detract from their inherent and intrinsic dignity, which they indeed have. But behaviorally, in terms of their capabilities, they just can't be like human. They can't act humanly. Because, well, I think Aristotle was right. I mean, that's the long and short of it, is that we are social beings by nature. And that's important because it reminds us to take seriously the various community dimensions of life, whether it be family, state, church, whatever else in between, whatever community, whatever social dimensions of our existence we have, those are necessary. And we'll see that especially is the case with friendship, as we'll look into as soon as we're done with book 1. We'll jump ahead to books 8 and 9. Anyway, just wanted to emphasize that teaching here. All right, but the last thing we talked about when we ran out of time last week was how Aristotle is emphasizing that happiness is absolutely final. It is that one thing that everybody, everywhere, from all times and places, seeks for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. His quote, if I recall it correctly, was that standing by itself alone renders life desirable and lacking nothing. And indeed it does. If you woke up one morning completely happy, in the true, full sense of the word, you wouldn't feel a need for anything at all. You'd still make money, hopefully you'd still feed your kids and do that stuff, but the point is your peace would be perfectly undisturbed. You wouldn't be restless and anxious and depressed. You'd have no reason to. You already have the very thing that all of those other anxieties you have are directed towards because you feel like you lack them. So what is it though? He still hasn't said specifically enough what it is. And the very last thing we said last class was that he's acknowledging it might very well be a truism. Everything he's said so far, it might just be obvious. So what can he contribute beyond the obvious? Well, here we go. He begins his discourse here by saying, are we then to suppose that while the carpenter and the shoemaker have definite functions belonging to them, that man as such has none, and is not designed by nature to fulfill any function? Must we not rather assume that just as the eye, the hand, and the foot, and each of the various members of the body manifestly, which means obviously, has a certain function of its own, so a human being also has a certain function, over and above all the functions of his particular members. What then precisely can this function be? He's deferring to that first principle that we talked about weeks and weeks ago. The whole is greater than the part. And he's looking at a human being and realizing we've got all these parts. We have 2 hands, we've got lungs, we've got a heart, we've got all these various parts, and each of them obviously exist for a reason. They each do something. They each have a particular function that nature, he says, has designed them to fulfill. And how could we look at all of these individual parts that we have with obvious designated purposes and suppose that the totality of the being to which these parts belong has no purpose? Is this just purposeless thing that for some reason exists and you can make that existence whatever you want and who cares? Right here he is refuting existential nihilism, which didn't exist by that title in his day, but it always has existed by one title or another. We certainly see it among the sophists, certain allusions to it at least. But it didn't become popular until Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre saying, human nature has nothing to which it is directed, has no purpose, has no function. Do whatever the heck you want with it. Your meaning is whatever you make it up to be, because there isn't a meaning to be found anyway. It's kind of, finding meaning is basically whatever you do to stop yourself from killing yourself, is what they would say. Well, no, Aristotle's saying obviously there's a meaning. Obviously there's a function to be discovered that our nature itself is directed towards, being that all of our individual parts have things that they themselves are directed towards, and the whole is greater than the part. But what is it? Well, he says we can perhaps discover it, or at least describe it. And by the way, if you're wondering if I feel that Aristotle has just completely discovered the meaning of life here, no, I don't. But I think he's onto something. I think he's at least getting the ball rolling for us. I think he has embarked better than anybody else upon the question of philosophically discovering the meaning of life, that to which human nature is directed towards. I don't think you're going to find a complete answer in Aristotle, but again, he's the best place to start with that. So he says we can perhaps describe this thing we're after by looking at the particular function of man. That thing about human nature that sets it aside from all other natures. Because that's what we do in general when we want to nail down what a good blank is. Put anything in that blank. You know what you mean when you call it a good blank. And what you mean is it does well that which it exists for the sake of. It performs well the function that it was called into existence for the sake of. This chalkboard, it belongs to the genus that is a category of being, board. It is a type of board. If it is a good chalkboard, and it is a good chalkboard, it's a very good chalkboard. We don't have good erasers, unfortunately, which is why I had to buy my own. But it is a good chalkboard. Why do we call it a good chalkboard? Do we call it a good chalkboard because it's rectangular? No. I mean, that's nice. That's good, but that's not why we call it a good chalkboard. Do we call it a good chalkboard because it succeeds in blocking from sight that which is behind it? Well, no. Any old board would do that. If that's all we wanted to do, we could have saved a lot of money by just buying some sheetrock, which would also be rectangular and block from sight that which is behind it. It's the cheapest way to build a wall. If all you need is to block the sight, maybe a couple other minor ends, sheetrock's your best bet. Cheapest thing, easiest way to go about that. You're not going to get a big, very expensive piece of slate. I don't know if this is real slate or not, but if it's not, it's a good imitation at least. Much more expensive, much more difficult to deal with than sheetrock. So why do we call it a good chalkboard? Well, if this is a good chalkboard, and again I'd say it is, it's because it does well that which its particular category of being within that genus. Aristotle would call it a species, but that in his metaphysics that doesn't just apply to types of animals. But anyway, this particular type of board, this chalk board, is good because it holds chalk well, repeatedly, so that you can put it on there, erase it off, put it on again, repeatedly. That's what makes this a good chalkboard. It does well that which separates it from all other boards. So applying that same analysis to human nature, we have to look at what category of beings human nature itself belongs to, and then try and ascertain what sets human nature aside from all those other beings in the more general categories that it belongs to. Okay, we are a life form. Does our good, therefore, consist in being healthy? Well, what lower thing, what more general thing do we share that in common with? Health. Plants. Yeah, even a plant can be healthy. So clearly the good of man, that which human nature is directed towards, does not consist in mere health. That is a good, just like it is a good for this chalkboard to be nice and rectangular. That's a good, certainly. But it's not the good. It's not the particular function. How about athleticism? An excellent life of sentience. What else do we share that in common with? Even animals. Even a dog can be athletic. So that's a good, but it can't be the good. because we share it with other beings that have distinct natures from our own. So what is it that sets human nature aside from all other natures in the general category of beings to which it belongs, namely animals? Well, reason. Did you say reason? Well, absolutely. That is one of the things. Thank you. I like that answer. More generally, our rationality, our reason. So, what then does the good of human nature consist in? Well, he says, in his own words, let me give you first, then I'll expound upon it. This function of human nature is the active exercise of the soul's faculties in conformity with the rational principle. We declare that the function of man is a certain form of life. And we define that form of life as the exercise of the soul's faculties and activities in association with the rational principle. Again, a modern existential nihilistic kind of joke of an answer to that question would be opposable thumbs, but that's not what sets us aside. Chop off your thumb, you'll still be just as human as you were before. You've just mutilated yourself is all. It is, of course, our rationality. And animals, of course, they all have varying degrees of intelligence, but there's also something that humans have that no animal does. Whatever you want to call it, Aristotle calls it a rational capability, a rationality. That also necessarily goes with a free will. Those go hand in hand. One can't exist without the other. So you could just as easily say our free will, and I think that'd be also a fair answer to this question. I think Aristotle missed that, which is why we don't see a complete picture here, but again, he's getting the ball rolling very well. It is, whether we call it the intellect or the will, those are what set us aside. So what can we have down? Well, let me give you some things for the next question in your notes. What, however, is happiness? That's where we're at right now. That is, what is the good of man and how is it ascertained? First of all, it is ascertained by examining man's particular function. And if we ascertain man's particular function, we see that it is the rational life. Therefore, the good of man, that is happiness or eudaimonia, consists in a life lived in accordance with that. It is a life lived in accordance with the rational faculty of the soul. Soul, mind, psyche, whatever you want to call it. First, before we go any farther, I must very strongly emphasize what he does not mean by this. This does not mean that the good man is the man with the high IQ. This is absolutely not what this means. The power of one's intelligence is not where the goodness relies. Is not where the goodness resides. The goodness resides not in the intellect, but where? The intellect discovers truths, but that's only the beginning of the good life. The good life consists in what? Yeah, exactly. Choosing to live in accordance with those discoveries. That choice is not undertaken within the intellect, it's undertaken within the will. The intellect discovers truths, and it presents these truths to the will. So the intellect is prior chronologically, but in terms of metaphysical superiority, that resides in the will, because it is the will that decides whether to obey the intellect's discovery as to what is true, or to reject it, and instead go with the lower desires that tend to often contradict what the intellect discovers is true. The desires that Socrates was always lamenting people living in accordance with, the desires for pleasure and comfort and money and honors and things like that. None of those are bad in and of themselves, but the good life is the one that is always willing to choose in accordance with what the intellect discovers is good and true, even if it requires going against what the lower desires pull one towards. So, in fact, sometimes a higher IQ, I dare say more often, a higher IQ means you're less likely to live the good life, because the higher IQ, the better you might become at what? Yeah, manipulation, rationalization. Your intellect has already succeeded in discovering what is true, but then if you are not honest with that, you start encouraging your intellect to keep working on the same question that you already know the answer to try and find some sort of a way out of it. The higher your IQ, the more likely you are to be able to do that, unfortunately. It doesn't take a high IQ to live the good life in accordance with this definition. There's a lot of arrogant people out there who defer to this Aristotelian teaching, but it's a perversion of what he's genuinely teaching. Because they think that, oh, the good person is the intelligent person. No, intelligence is a good, but the good life consists not in the power of the intelligence, but again, what I said. So, someone with a very low IQ is perfectly capable of looking at, the example I always use, looking at the half gallon of ice cream sitting in front of him and determining, you know what? I could have 2 scoops of this and put it back, and then put the half gallon back, because that would be plenty for me to have right now. I don't need 10,000% of my saturated fat for the day if I were to have the whole half gallon. I have a freezer. It's not going to go to waste. I can just put it back in the freezer. I'm going to get sick. I'm going to feel terrible if I eat this whole thing, and I'm going to start gaining weight, and all these, that does not take a high IQ at all to go through. And yet, if you're like me, you tend to try to cram as much of that half gallon into your stomach as you can, because it's just so tasty. And unfortunately, I too often choose to contradict what the intellect discovers is good and true. So I'm still working on leading the good life, as we all are, of course. Aristotle is laying out the black and white extremes here. We're all somewhere in between. We all know that. But the point is, if you lay out what's clearly black and white, you can at least direct yourself accordingly, even though we're all works in progress. So, this is fully capable of being, this good life, as Aristotle is defining it, is fully capable of being lived by anyone, no matter how low the IQ. Yes, a high IQ can be helpful for the real dilemmas. But the real dilemmas are relatively rare. Usually we know exactly what we should do. It's not confusing at all. The difficulty resides in carrying it out and actually choosing to do it. Okay, continuing on here. He says, this must occupy a complete lifetime. A brief period of happiness does not make a man supremely blessed and happy. You can't live this life for a day and then proclaim yourself living the good life. This is a continuous thing. It's not a hot and cold. It's not a phase. It's not a fad. It's got to be who you are. It's got to be who you become. He goes on to point out that the various other things that we know harmonize well with this conclusion, and indeed they do. And then he says something I love. Just as at the Olympic Games, the wreaths of victory are not bestowed upon the handsomest and the strongest persons present, but on men who enter for the competitions, since it is among these that the winners are found. So it is those who act rightly, who carry off the prizes and the good things of life. Aristotle would look at you funny if you said, "Oh, he's a good person. He doesn't kill or steal," as if what you don't do makes you good. Far from it. What you do makes you good. Yes, of course, the good life requires avoiding things as well. But it's above all about doing things, doing the good things that the intellect presents to you as good and true. It is an active life. And not only is it an active life, he says, the life of active virtue is essentially pleasant. It's enjoyable. Virtue, Aristotle says, virtue is not some miserable, joyless undertaking that we just have to deal with because it's the right thing to do, and bummer, I hate my life. No, he loves it. And anybody who really regularly pursues virtue will also love it. Not at first. At first, these things are often difficult. But over time, good things become enjoyable to the one living the good life. Unfortunately, Aristotle says most people aren't like this. He says the mass of mankind take pleasure in things that conflict with one another. But the lovers of what is noble have no need of pleasure as a sort of ornamental appendage. Their life contains it in its essence. The hedonist, is who Aristotle was describing in that first quote, is always desiring things that are in conflict with one another. He wants this high, but he wants this low. He wants this good here, this pleasurable thing here, and this pleasurable thing here, and it's impossible to have both at the same time, and sometimes they're even starkly contradicting each other. But the good life, true goods never conflict. So you don't have this constant civil war in your soul that Aristotle will describe later. Happiness, therefore, he says, is at once the best, the noblest, and the pleasantest of things. He paints, rightfully so, a much more attractive picture of the good life than many other philosophers do. You know, I'm always criticizing Kant. He said good things. I don't mean to only criticize him, but he doesn't paint a very attractive picture of the good life. For him, it's just this strict duty thing. You can't even think about building up your joy and your peace and your happiness. It's that would like sully your motives in the view of a strict deontological, ethics-based philosophy. But that's ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be happy. We all want to be happy, whether or not we admit it. Okay, he moves on. He says, inasmuch as happiness is a certain activity of the soul in accordance with goodness, it is necessary to examine the nature of goodness. A true statesman has as his aim, you all know this already from our Crito unit. I don't know if this is just buried in the middle of a paragraph, so of course I didn't quiz you on it, but Aristotle is saying right here that the aim of a true statesman, meaning any politician, his aim is to make the citizens good. Because of course, a good friend, just as a good friend, as we'll see in the next discussion, wants what is good for his friend, so too a good politician wants what is good for the citizens. But Aristotle just spent all this time demonstrating that what is good is the happy life, the life lived in accordance with the rational faculty of the soul. And in the next several books, he goes through a lot. He fleshes out a lot of the concrete details of what that looks like, which we don't have time for, unfortunately. But you might wonder, well, this still seems vague, and yes, it is. But it's the foundation for analyzing the various virtues, and he lists tons of virtues. And he paints a really good picture of the virtuous life. Not an absolutely complete one, but a good one. This is what the true statesman, Aristotle says, the genuine politician should want to inspire in the people in his society. Because he should want them to have the greatest good, happiness. He shouldn't just want them to have a bunch of money and comfort and pleasure. Sure, he'll want to ensure their economic and financial security as much as possible, but not at the expense of what is good. Human goodness means, in our view, excellence of soul, not excellence of body. Also, our definition of happiness is an activity of the soul. Now, if this is so, clearly it behooves the statesman to have some acquaintance with psychology, just as the physician who is to heal the eye or the other parts of the body must know their anatomy. Psychology, he means it a little differently when he says it as when it's approached today, by some at least. But psychology, this is the study of the human psyche, and what its goodness resides in. You really have to study that as a politician, Aristotle's saying. You have to know what is good for the human soul if you want to be able to rule humans well. Because you're not there merely to look over their bodies. You're there to look over them, their whole being. Okay. I want to finish this as quickly as possible, so I'm going to skip a few things I usually go over here and just make sure I give you what you need for your discussion sheet. What dilemma regarding the higher part of the soul does Aristotle address toward the end of Book 1, and how does he resolve it? I'm just taking a peek at your sheets to make sure that's okay. Good. All right. So there's a dilemma here, of course, because, well, that which the rational part of our soul tells us is true and good is not that which we always or even often feel ourselves compelled towards. That ice cream is sitting in front of us and we want to devour the whole thing. Why? Why do we want to do things that are not good for us? Well, the answer to that why, I don't think philosophy can discover. I think you'd have to go beyond the bounds of philosophy for that. But philosophy can at least say, Aristotle points out, that this does not get the final say. Why? Because we admonish delinquents, he says. The mere fact that we admonish delinquents, that's his quote, I know it's a little harsh sounding, but implies what? Admonishment implies a should, in other words, implies what? It rhymes, there's my hint. Should implies could. You don't admonish somebody for not doing something that they couldn't help, that they couldn't do, I mean. Whenever one admonishes another, there is the presupposition that it was possible for that person to do otherwise than how he so chose to act. Aristotle says, well, look, in society in general, we admonish people who do wrong. And this is different from, for example, the case of a dog. If you get home after class and your dog has scattered the garbage all around the floor, you'll scold him in hopes that you can kind of steer his instincts away from wanting to do that. But do you ground him for 2 weeks? No. Because your dog is not going to sit there and think, oh man, shouldn't have done that. That was unjust. I'm really learning my lesson right now, just pondering the injustice I committed by making a mess in the house. Your dog's not going to do that. We don't admonish animals like we admonish humans. Yes, they have kind of an analogous type of situation, but it's purely analogous. It's not what humans have, or we legitimately admonish. You can, just thinking back to our various discussions in the Socratic dialogues, where justice is supposed to be healing. And it doesn't always do that, unfortunately, but it is at least fundamentally capable of doing that. That we can learn, we can realize that we've done something wrong, and we can strive to do better in the future by learning our lessons. That is the resolution to the dilemma. It may not be exactly what we want to hear, but it's true. He says we have this rational principle urging us in the right direction, exhorting us to the best course. But our nature seems also to contain another element besides that of the rational principle, which combats and resists it, just like a body with paralysis. Sorry, I'm going back and forth a bit here, but I like the example of paralysis. Have you ever woken up in the morning and your arm is under the pillow or something and you command it to move and it doesn't even move? It's horrible. It's like you should be able to tell your hand what to do, but if you were sleeping on it wrong and it lost all its blood circulation, it won't obey your mind. Well, unfortunately, that same dynamic seems to play out in the soul in general, Aristotle is saying here. But it's not unresolvable. It can be overcome, and we have to believe that. Aristotle is saying, don't say it's just who you are. Don't say your vices are just who you are. No, they're not. You can overcome them, he's saying. It'll be difficult at first, maybe, but it can be done. So what can we put down for a short and sweet answer for that? Let's see. The dilemma is that, well, first of all, this is really his answer, and it's probably all you really need for your notes for that question. But let me put down one more thing above it. There is an irrational principle in the soul that combats the rational. But should implies could. He puts it more bluntly. Our employment of admonishing delinquents demonstrates that it can be overcome. I'll just say should implies could, and that, in other words, the irrational principle can be overcome. All right. So he ends this book, book 1, by prefacing that he's going to dive into detailing some of these virtues. And the virtues, again, are just those behaviors that one discovers to be good when he applies reason to human nature. He set the foundation for this analysis in book 1, and he's going to undertake it in a regimented fashion in the following books, which, for the sake of time, we unfortunately have to skip. But suffice it to say, he delineates a lot of the traditional virtues that you have long heard of. Good philosophy tends to confirm what we already know by other reasons, and it makes us more certain of it, and makes us know it more clearly so as to better carry it out. So, we're going to skip several books, only for the sake of time. I would love to go through them, and we're going to talk about the other very important books in Nicomachean ethics, namely 8 and 9. But before we do that, as always, let's take a quiz.